know he comes from Springfield. He was born in the early 30s, which means that by the time he was growing up and starting to play, the band era was pretty much over. So he's really the first generation of musicians to come up in Charlie Parker's shadow. And I want to ask him about this, he studied with Lenny Tristano, but he's the only major musician I can think of who studied with Lenny who didn't end up playing like Lenny. So he clearly had his own sense of direction. If you listen to the really early Prestige recordings, you hear Parker all over it. And he goes on and he has, I think Phil Woods is a good example of the whole question of how do you survive and have a career in this music. Because in the arts, we very often, and especially in jazz, we look at a musician and we say, well, he did all the good stuff when he was young, and then the rest of it, it's like, you know, not necessarily resting on your laurels, but the innovations are in the past. Phil, it's more like Philip Roth. If Philip Roth had never published a word before he was 60, he'd still be the best writer in the country. I think Phil really starts to become great after he comes back from Europe in the early 70s. Before that, he's one of several alto players. He never really gets a signature sound the way Cannonball does, Jackie McLean. He tries cool jazz, intricate arrangements. He works with all kinds of different musicians. He composes a very interesting piece, The Rites of Swing. He does studio work. He does big band work. And then he gives up, basically. I mean, like a lot of musicians, it's a terrible period, the late 60s. And he went to Europe, and he lived there, I guess, for 4 or 5 years. First time I saw him was at the Newport Jazz Festival with his European rhythm machine. And then he came back, and I never heard this, but apparently he went to California and started an electric band that didn't do very well. And then right after that, he puts together a group that unbelievably almost is basically still together after 30 plus years. At least the bass and drummer have remained the same. It had a series of pianists, but not that many, considering how much time has gone. And then switched from a quartet to a quintet, keeping a brass instrument by his side, which he also did in the early 50s. It's something else I'd like to hear him speak about. But when he comes back, he really develops in a different way. He becomes the virtuoso alto saxophone player who does all kinds of things with his timbre. He squeaks, he growls, he grunts, he does fish calling type sounds, he pops the keys. He seems to be stretching the alto as far as you can go and still be playing basically within the parameters of the music he grew up in. He's never going to be an avant-garde player, although you can hear that there are elements that he absorbed. His composing, I think, is very underrated. His tunes are really good and very evocative. I was listening the other day to My Pal Benny. It really captures Benny Carter. And he keeps growing personally as a musician, but there's an incredible stability there. So that, he settles in the Delaware Water Gap and he has his own festival and he's involved in education and he tours the world and he plays the clubs. He does all the things that jazz musicians do to make a living. And he manages to keep fresh, and that's the best thing you could say about a musician. A man in his 70s who's still playing like he means it. I would say as a characteristic album, one that comes to mind is All of Bird's Children, I think it was called. It's got some originals, it's got standards, it's got the working group, and he just plays throughout with tremendous velocity. You know, if it's fair to say, and I think it is, that he started out as being one of Bird's children and that the Parker influence was really clear, you wouldn't confuse him with anyone on a blindfold test now, any more than you would Clark Terry at this point. I mean, just as soon as he starts playing, there's a kind of effusiveness, tremendous energy in his playing. Although I noticed, there was another record I liked very much that he did, I think it was for Chesky with Tommy Flanagan, in which he plays a lot of clarinet. And he does Blue and Sentimental and some things like that. And when he plays clarinet, there's a different personality. It's more subdued, a little quieter. I wouldn't say more soulful, but it's a different and more meditative, I think. I don't know if that's a property of the instrument or of the kinds of technique he has on the instrument as opposed to the alto, because the alto you get the feeling just grew out of his throat. The clarinet he may not have the same, although when he went to Juilliard apparently he was forced to study the clarinet. I guess they didn't consider the saxophone a legitimate instrument. I think that there aren't a lot of Phil Woods records that aren't good, but there are moments that when I've heard him in clubs and on some of the records where I hear a glibness, where I think, and I want to ask him about this. I think virtuosity, and there's no question that he is a virtuoso, can be a trap, and that sometimes instead of using the virtuosity to play the music, you use the music to show off your virtuosity. I don't think it's that he shows it off so much as that sometimes it's there, and it's very tempting. And it's when he slows down and when he really focuses in, or when I think that's one of the reasons, incidentally, I'm speculating here, why he is so good in duets and in jam sessions, because there's a competitive thing that goes on that really focuses him. And he's playing, virtuosity is not going to serve him there by itself, because he's working with, great figures. I think that's one of the things that, I used to love to see him with Benny Carter. He used to do it every Labor Day. They just brought out something in each other. There was just this tremendous respect, and they were playing for the audience, but they were also playing for themselves. And when he's really focused, he's a great ballad player, for example. And when he really, tunes in on a ballad, he can break your heart. He has that quality. But there's also this thing, there was a period when he made so many records, like Sonny Stitt, that some of the records are great and some of the records would be great for anyone else, but not at the level that or Sonny Stitt had achieved. The only place I hear the classical influence, I'd have to say, is in some of his arrangements. I hear it in the Rites of Swing, but no, I don't hear it in his playing. To me, and this is one of the things I admire about him, is he really sounds like he comes out of jazz. The blues is in everything he plays. The velocity, he has great pitch, but that's not unique to classical music. All great jazz musicians, or at least most, have good pitch, great pitch. His intonation is a jazz intonation, conspicuously so. I mean, if you said to me that Lee Konitz has spent a lot of years playing classical music, and I don't think he did actually, that would sound more logical to me in a way, because he has that kind of, almost a conservatory kind of tone. Whereas Phil, especially after the early 70s, there are times when he sounds like Earl Bostic. He blows with such force, and yet always with control. I'll tell you, one of the best examples was a few years ago, maybe not more than 3 summers ago at JVC, when Antonio Hart came out with him, and Antonio had apparently been woodshedding with him or something. And there was a time when Antonio was doing a little Cannibal, a little McLean. Man, he was playing Phil, and it just improved his playing. There was a clarity and a vitality. A lot of performers, younger performers, have very mixed feelings about how directly they want to communicate with an audience. I remember once writing a piece about a singer who I said, why does she bother coming out on stage? She hides behind the musicians. She mumbles so that you can't hear any of the lyrics that she writes. And she was recording for Blue Note, and Bruce Lundvall told me, he called her up and said, did you see the piece in The Voice? And he said, he's right. And she said, I know he is. And she really thought it through and decided if she's going to be a performer, then she's going to be a performer. I mean, you can't go up there with an attitude, it's like, I'm too hip to perform, and yet that's what I do. And on a different level, a more subtle level perhaps, a lot of musicians are sort of, they grew up with this idea of the Miles Davis type figure he's really playing for himself and he will let you listen in. And whereas the players who've been around for a long time love the interchange with the audience. I mean, Duke Ellington always said that the dancers influenced the tempos he chose, influenced the way the musicians played, influenced the way the band sounded. So Antonio comes out with Phil, and Phil is, just raging as he usually is at those things, and it seemed contagious. And so I've always liked Antonio's playing, but I don't think I ever heard him play with so much, unembarrassed emotion and feeling in his playing. And I think that if you're an alto player coming up, Phil is going to be the guy that a lot of people are going to go to because he's such a master of the instrument, and because he's so much in the pocket, as it were, of the music. Jackie McLean, great player, you can pick up a lot of phrases from him, but if you try to take his tone, his approach to timbre and pitch, it's not going to work. It only works for him. Whereas Phil is really right down the middle in that respect. And because he plays everything, because he's a great blues player and a great ballad player, and he can play at any tempo, and because he has this incredible vitality, and because, and this is very important, he really has thought through what a quartet or what a quintet is. It's never just, I'm going to play and you guys are going to back me up, which is what a lot of the bop guys did, basically. It's like, wow, I'm getting to play with Charlie Parker and I'll follow you. His groups are very integrated in terms of musically. And almost the way, Bill Evans' trio is integrated, or Tommy Flanagan's. It's never just one guy and accompaniment. So for all of those reasons, there's a lot that young players can go to in his records and learn from. Lee, that's it. Lee Konitz and Phil Woods, the yin and the yang. It's interesting because you can't hardly think of two players who are the same age, similar background musically, who are so different in their approaches and their style. Good example of that is when Jerry Mulligan put together the Birth of the Cool Band. And he used Phil on some performances in the recording, and he used Lee when he could get Lee on other things. And man, the band changes depending on which one of them is in it, because Lee plays in that very cool, controlled style that fits right in with the brass instruments, and Phil plays with a relative bluster. I mean, it's a very tasteful and tactful bluster, but it's a much larger sound, and I don't think one is better than the other by any means. I mean, actually, I think you could say that Phil's version of the band, or the version of the band with Phil in it, is maybe more exciting and maybe easier for a lot of people to connect with. But they're both extremely individual players, and it is amazing that even alto players who came up in later years, in the 50s, whatever happened. Cannibal, of course, passed on, and Oliver Nelson died, but what happened to Gene Quill, and all those players that Phil was involved with in the 50s and 60s, all those rival alto players that were out there, they just seem to have, a lot of them, fallen by the wayside. I was listening to a quintet session he did in '54 with a trumpet player named John Wilson. I'd never heard of John Wilson. Not a bad player. I mean, who was he? What happened to him? Was he a drug guy, or had another life or something? But maybe it was a pseudonym. I don't know. So a lot of those guys didn't really, survive. They didn't. That's, again, to go back to what we were saying before. One of the things about Phil is that he is the poster boy for having a career, having a lifetime in jazz, without losing your sense of importance, your sense of self, your sense of growing, without exhausting yourself. Art Pepper, had this amazing second career. I always wonder how players who come up together, playing the same instrument especially, feel about each other. There's a sense of competition, or, if they're as petty as writers are with each other. I don't know. Hal Crook did an arrangement for one of Phil's records of From This Moment On. It's, it's like a very shrewd, unusual arrangement. It's not showy, it's not self-important, it's none of the bad things. It's just, you just listen to it and say, wow, I've never heard the tune thought of quite that way. And, that's what musicians, when they're really operating well, are trying to do. They're trying to make you hear old things in new ways without calling attention to the newness, without making it into a novelty. And, you know, he associates himself with musicians like that, Bill Charlap and Hal Galper, Jim McNeely. I mean, these guys are very thoughtful players. They're not glib, although they're all technically amazing. I think one of the absolutely pivotal moments in the history of American music is when Louis Armstrong in 1929 recorded I Can't Give You Anything But Love. And it was attacked all over the place by those moldy figs. Up to that point, he had been recording pop music written by himself and friends. For the most part, it wasn't as good. They weren't as good as the Tin Pan Alley guys. And what Armstrong proved in that recording is, you know, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Why shouldn't we use this stuff? This stuff was made for us. Most of it was influenced by us. Harold Arlen couldn't write those tunes without the precedence of blues and jazz musicians. Gershwin was listening to it. There's a reason I Got Rhythm became second only to the blues among chord changes that musicians play. So that's really why that was, one of the reasons that was a golden period, because you've got guys really learning, inventing the music as soloists. They're taking Armstrong as a platform. They're going beyond it. They're building in all different kinds of ways. You know, more sophisticated soloists, Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Roy Eldridge, and then Charlie Parker, Dizzie Gillespie. But regardless of the way the music evolves over that 20-year period, those tunes always stand up for them. I mean, maybe the bebop guys would write their own melodies on top of the changes. Maybe they would add substitute chords in different ways, but they're still playing those tunes. Somebody asked me the other day, why How High the Moon? And you know, I don't know enough about music to say exactly what about those changes, except as a fan, I can't even think about that tune without improvising on it, because there's something about that tune, all the things you are, that just, you know, you right away hear variations. You fall through the chords. It's almost as though, you know, it was invented for jazz musicians. And because they're the same generation, there is a certain similarity in where they come from and the way they're thinking about music. I mean, these guys may be primarily black musicians with a, you know, who are dedicated to swinging and working with blues scales and what have you, but they're the same age as these Jewish and other white guys who are growing up, who are writing for Broadway and the theater, and they're all hearing the same kind of stuff. And they're using it in different ways, and it was a perfect match. And when pop music went left, before jazz really did, I mean, jazz did in the avant-garde, and it basically said, you know, we don't need any of that stuff. But the mainstream of jazz pretty much remained in the center, still playing chord changes, still playing pitch, and, you know, tunes that resolved every 32 or 12 measures. And suddenly they can't find that material on the top 40. They're writing tunes for kids, or they're writing really simplistic tunes. You know, Herbie Hancock comes along and he says, I'm going to use this material, and he does a record called New Standards. He had to rewrite all the changes because there was nothing for the musicians to play. And I said to him, well, then what's the point? You just proved that they're not the new standards. You basically rewrote them so that they would work. If you have to do that, then, you know, who are we kidding? There's still, you know, everybody plays the same tunes, which is a problem. But there are hundreds of tunes that get forgotten, and, you know, good tunes. I mean, recently I was looking at Jerome Kern's, you know, work list. And he wrote something like 600 tunes. There's only 35 that everybody plays. So I'm sure if somebody, you know, went through the trouble, you'd find a whole bunch of lead sheets for great songs. You know, you watch the MGM musicals, you'll discover tunes all the time that sounds good, could work for a musician. There are tunes that musicians have found in recent songs that seem to work, but for the most part, there's a reason that, you know, everybody loves the Beatles. Nobody's debating the Beatles anymore. Kids, my daughter listens to the Beatles as though it were classical music, you know. She was 8, they were listening to the Beatles. They don't know who Elvis Presley is, but the Beatles, sure. But there's a reason, nonetheless, that musicians haven't gravitated to those tunes. They just don't work in this context. They don't have, and I'll get killed by the rock people, but it's a word we use. We know what it means. There's a certain hipness that musicians require from tunes, and the way the harmonies lay out, and the feeling of blues, and I don't know, just in a way that sort of allows you to honor the tune and at the same time go beyond the tune. And a lot of modern pop tunes like the Beatles are cloying in that sense. You can play the melody, but it's very hard to get beyond the melody. I mean, what can you do with a tune like Michelle, and that's not even one of their great tunes, but it's a different music at this point, and it doesn't lend itself to the same kind of creativity. Jazz musicians love harmony, and harmony was one of the first things that rock musicians sort of sacrificed. And then, to everybody's astonishment, with the rise of hip-hop, they sacrificed melody. They made rhythm more prominent than it ever had been, but suddenly they're chanting. And, you know, jazz musicians, especially who grew up in that period, some of them hired rappers. They tried to, it just doesn't work. It's a different music. If you're listening to this, and you want to hear this, and you want to be moved by this, having a guy in the middle come out and sing a rap about, you know, George Bush, it's just not what you came for. It might work, it might not. And I think when musicians get to a certain area in their lives, a certain period, when they know that they're never going to get the brass ring of show business, and they finally give up on that, sometimes that is an incredibly liberating moment. I think it was for Phil Woods, for example, when you finally say, you know, this is who I am. I do this better than anybody else, or at least as well as anyone else ever has or ever will. I'm not really sure why the Tin Pan Alley world became so Jewish, because for a long period in the late 19th century it wasn't really. And then suddenly it was. I think that, a lot of the, first of all, we know that a lot of the major figures like Harold Arlen and Irving Berlin grew up in musically religious families where the father was a cantor or they spent a lot of time in the synagogue and they grew up hearing music. And the one thing that you can't mistake about Jewish music and black music is the similarity in terms of what we call blue notes, but the pentatonic scale and the kind of soulfulness and also the improvisation, especially in Orthodox Jewish. You know, I didn't grow up Orthodox, but I went to an Orthodox service once upstate New York, and everybody was singing a different tune at the same time, and I thought, my God, this is Ascension. This is Coltrane's Ascension. And and then also there's you know, everything becomes like a family. So if there's a whole bunch of Jews working here and Italians working there, the Jews will attract more Jews, the Italians will attract more Italians. One songwriter I once asked this question to, and he said it's all because of Jolson. I said, why? He said, well, Jolson was Jewish. He was by far the most popular performer in the country. Everybody wanted to write for him, and everybody wanted to write Mammy songs. And none of the composers had been south of New Jersey. So we all wrote Mammy songs with a Jewish sound for Al Jolson. And then when he stopped, nobody ever wrote a Mammy song again because that was his thing. But you know, except for Cole Porter, Richard Whiting, very few others, Jews so dominate that little period between 1925 and 1950, really. And it's hard to know exactly why. But there are still Jews prominent in Tin Pan Alley when it turns over to rock and roll, but it's a different kind of thing, you know. It's just what seems to have happened after the golden period and before rock and roll was that everybody started writing novelties, and they were unsophisticated and they were uninteresting and they were popular for a minute and a half. And they didn't attract Jewish composers, and they didn't attract black jazz musicians. It was a white, sort of a white bread kind of music that was there in the middle. And all these people who recorded them, I've interviewed a number of them over the years. I once asked Perry Como, not the hippest singer in the world, and he knows it, not a swinging performer, by no means jazz related, but nonetheless, pretty voice, who grew up listening to the great ballads and had good taste in songs. And I used to just abominate those things he would record, Hey Diggity Diggity, and I don't know what the hell. And I once asked him, how'd you feel about those songs? And he said, how the hell do you think I felt about them? I hated them, but they put my kids through college and they bought me a beautiful house in Florida. That's what I do. It's my profession. Somebody hands you a hit and it makes you millions of dollars. Are you going to say no? As I said earlier, I think that nobody would mistake him on a blindfold test. That at the beginning, there is the sense that he's working his way through the Charlie Parker language, and he quotes Charlie Parker. I mean, all over the place, and he's got the sound, and you can hear that, you know, Parker is the figure he's chosen to figure out who he is and how he's going to play. But as Louis Armstrong said, jazz is only what you are, and. You know, I once asked Benny Carter, I said, is style something that you are conscious of? And he said, no. And I said, basically, so it's like writing, where you simply try to do it the best you can, and whoever you are will come out as the style once you've mastered whatever the form is. And he said, that's what I think, absolutely. And I think Phil, at some point, got beyond the period of worship, and then there was a period when I get the feeling, at least in the mid-50s, when he's consciously trying not to be Charlie Parker by writing arrangements that are just a little bit too fussy and you know, playing with his tone in a way that I feel he's sort of reined in. And then I think after the period in Europe, when he comes out, he is not in anybody's shadow. He doesn't sound like anybody. He doesn't sound like Bird or Cannibal or McLean. He is just one of the individuals on the instrument, certainly as of that point. I mean, I really don't think anyone could confuse him with anyone else. So he went from, like a lot of great artists, from somebody who's been influenced, who has assimilated his influences, who's made them part of himself, and then becomes more and more individual until he becomes an influence. So that there are players now who will listen to Phil Woods, young players with a poor sense of history, and get it straight from Phil without even knowing what part of it comes from Parker. Phil Woods is a consummate musician and a very generous band leader who's produced a growing generation of important young musicians. And he represents the constancy of this music, that you keep on keeping on, and that it makes you stronger. And you just travel the course. You honor it to your last breath.